Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to chair today the first plenary lecture of the 19th World Congress of IFAC, and it is my privilege to introduce to you today's speaker, Professor Naomi Leonard. Naomi obtained his bachelor degree in mechanical engineering in 1985 at Princeton. And then she worked for a while in the power industry, and then she came back to the academia and got her PhD in electrical engineering at the University of Maryland in 1994. And she is currently Edwin S. Weasley Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Princeton University, where she is also Director of Princeton's Council on Science and Technology and affiliated faculty member of the Princeton Neuroscience Institute and Program on Quantitative and Computational Biology. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, fellow of IEEE, of ASME, SIAM, and she will receive the degree of Fellow of IFAC during this Congress. She has received numerous awards, which include the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, the Mohammed Dali Award from UCSB, and the inaugural Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Maryland. And today she will talk of coordinated control of multi-agent systems, lessons from collective animal behavior.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Alberto, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for a warm welcome. It's a great honor and pleasure to speak to you today. And as my title suggests, I'm going to argue that for the coordinated control of multi-agent systems, we have much to learn from the collective behavior of animal groups. And I'm going to focus today on convincing you of 3 points, 3 key points, I think. The first is that there's a strong analogy between the animals in a group and agents in a multi-agent system. And the second point is that the collective behaviors of animal groups that emerge from the feedback interconnections between individual animals demand our attention as control engineers because they exhibit the very kind of robust and adaptive behaviors that we as control engineers try to design when we seek to make distributed control laws for multi-agent systems that must perform in complex environments. And thirdly, I want to convince you that it's possible to rigorously connect the mechanisms that explain the robust and adaptive behavior of collective animals to a systematic way of thinking about design of multi-agent systems. Okay, so first, by multi-agent system, I'm referring to a collection of many individuals, which we're going to call agents, where each agent can independently modify its own dynamics, can independently sense its environment, which might include sensing some of what others in the group are doing, and can independently respond to what it senses. So a network of autonomous vehicles like the ones shown, or a power network, for example, these are examples of multi-agent systems when each vehicle, or each windmill in this case, has sensors, actuators, and a computer. Likewise, a group of animals is a natural multi-agent system because each animal can, of course, move around independently, can sense its environment, including what some of the others in its group are doing, and can make its own calls on how it's going to respond to what it senses. Now, in the context of control, the driving problem is, or a driving problem is, how do we prescribe agent-level control laws that guarantee performance at the level of the group when it's likely that individuals may be limited in their ability to do control, communication, sensing, computation. And likewise, in the context of animal groups, a driving problem is to find those mechanisms that explain the high performance of these groups, despite the fact that as individuals, animals may also be limited in their ability to sense, communicate, and compute. So I'm just going to start with this beautiful video so that you can be inspired in the way that I'm hoping you'll be inspired through this talk. This is obviously a school of fish, and I think one of the beautiful things in this video is that you can actually see how, in a very smooth way, the group is able to transition in its collective behavior. So first from this kind of circular motion, and eventually it's going to move into a polarized motion. And this is despite uncertainties, despite variation in information and opinions among the fish in the group. They move together so smoothly. And biologists attribute the high performance and the ability of animal groups to perform so well to the social interactions among these individuals. So the idea is that these groups, because individuals can sense and respond to at least others nearby, they form a spatial network. And I'm showing you here an example of the kind of model that's commonly found in the biology literature that describes how they model these interactions. So here in the center is an individual fish, let's just call it the focal fish, and this is a model that's dependent on how far away its neighbors are. So those neighbors that are within the sort of smallest annulus, they'll move away from, they'll repel from those to avoid collisions. Any other fish in this sort of secondary alignment zone, they call it, that's a comfortable distance away, they'll align with them so that they can move with them. And fish that are in this outer annulus, not too far, but a little too far, they'll be attracted to and try to move closer. So you get this kind of cohesion and repulsion among fish with respect to their near neighbors. And it creates this sensing interaction network. And this has been used to show, for example, in this paper by Danny Grumbaum from 1998, that a group of fish is able to climb a gradient, is able to find the source of, say, a distributed plume in a noisy environment, despite the fact that a single fish wouldn't be able to do that on its own. So they work kind of as a filter. And Cousin et al. Showed in 2002, this is a beautiful paper in which they showed that with very small changes in parameters, for example, in the radius of the alignment zone, that a school of fish could smoothly transition between a circular kind of motion and a polarized kind of motion. So in these examples that I've shown here, my students and colleagues and I made use of these kinds of inspirational results from the biology literature to design coordinated control strategies that we then apply to a network of these autonomous vehicles called underwater gliders that I'm showing you in this video here. And the idea was that we demonstrated them in the field, in the ocean, to do ocean sampling off the coast of California in Monterey Bay. And these were field experiments that lasted over the course of a month, with the vehicles moving around on their own with these control strategies. And in 2003, you'll see in the second video up top, we demonstrated an algorithm that we had proved in which a little network of vehicles, and you see them in this experiment, they're the three corners of the triangle, were programmed, were controlled to be coordinated into, in this case, a triangle, whereby the triangle could dilate, could rotate, could translate, so that we could do things like have each vehicle take a scalar measurement of the field, say temperature, and then collectively they could do things like adjust their dilation so that they could optimally estimate the gradient and then follow the gradient and find, say, the cold water or the warm water as was needed for the oceanography. In 2006, we had proved some algorithms for design of stabilizing control laws, distributed control laws, so that a group of agents could move in a whole family of stabilizable motion patterns that involved individuals moving along closed curves in a coordinated fashion. So you can see in this video what we did was deploy the vehicles, and again, you're looking overhead. This is a region that's something like 20 kilometers by 40 kilometers and even something like 1,000 meters deep, and the circles are showing you the positions over time. This is over the month of August 2006, moving together in this coordinated way along these patterns, these circular motions, but coordinated so that they would do things like maximize entropic information in the data that they collected. And you can see the flow field in the back, that they were doing this despite pretty strong currents, and these underwater gliders move pretty slowly, so this was no mean feat. Okay, so underlying these kinds of collective behaviors, I would suggest that sort of a fundamental problem is the collective decision-making problem. So ultimately, we want to know, how do we enable a group of these agents, a network of these agents, so that together as a group they'll be able to make a single decision, say a single decision among alternatives. And how do they do that when on their own they may have very differing opinions, they may not know what's going on, they may not be sufficiently capable to make a good decision. So for instance, how can we enable a network to make a decision between alternatives to determine which one is true, or which action to take, or which direction to follow, or which motion pattern to follow, or when has a change been detected? And I've listed here some works from the literature. This is a growing literature in which researchers have made rigorous the connections between things like collective decision-making, performance measures like speed, like accuracy, like the speed-accuracy trade-off, and how that connects to measures associated with the network, with who's sensing whom. So for example, speed and algebraic connectivity of the network graph, accuracy and effective resistances within the network. And these are helping us to understand how we can do these kinds of things in a systematic way so that we can create performance. But I would suggest that one of the features that's missing is this adaptive story. So how do we do all this, and how do we do it in response to environments that change without having to make very disruptive changes? How can we make our systems very smoothly adapt to changing circumstances? And so this brings me back to the story of animals, because this is precisely what animals do. In fact, animals rely on their ability as a group to make consensus decisions, to make decisions together, and to do so in a timely way, in an effective way, and to do so no matter what the conditions in the environment. So I've just shown you a few photographs to give you some idea of situations in which animals need to make these kind of decisions. These are pavement ants, and they have to be smart about making choices about when they're going to attack the neighboring colony. And they have to do it, no matter if it's raining or if conditions have changed. This is a photograph of some tiny schooling fish, and they have to be very accurate and quick about how they make decisions about which way to go, for example, for foraging or to evade predators. And they have to do it together. These animals, if they split up, they lose all the advantages that they have to group living. So sticking together is very critical. This is another example. These are Dunlin birds on a rest stop in Alaska. They have to make these kinds of decisions together about when it's time to resume their migration. So when are they sated? What's the food availability like where they are? When is it time to move on? And they have to do this again together. So I think the big question then is, we've got this motivation from the animal world. How is it that we can go about in a rigorous and systematic way to capitalize on the understandings that we have or that we can gain from the mechanisms of collective animal behavior? And so what I'm going to do today is to give you some sense of some new work that we've done to develop an approach towards a realization theory of collective decision-making. And with this idea of connecting natural behavior to design. And I'm going to start by telling you what I think is an astonishing story of house hunting honeybees. And I'm going to show you how we use models to understand the adaptive decision-making of house hunting honeybees. And then I'm going to introduce the notion of singularities and talk about how singularities can be used to organize collective behavior. So I'm going to rely on singularity theory, which is a robust bifurcation theory. So the idea is that this theory allows us not only to understand how solutions to dynamics change as a function of parameters via bifurcation diagrams, it also talks about how we can predict how bifurcation diagrams themselves will change when we add perturbations to the dynamics. And then finally, I'm going to propose an abstract collective decision-making model that provides a realization. And I'm going to use this organizing principle to show you how we can make this connection between collective decision-making in nature and in design. Okay, so I just want to read off this quote by Tom Seeley and Berman in their seminal paper in 1999. One of the most spectacular examples of an animal group functioning as an adaptive unit is a swarm of honeybees choosing its future home. I mean, this is really a fantastic story when honeybees multiply and they become too numerous for their hive. The old queen leaves with about half of the worker bees. So she takes with her something on the order of 10,000 bees and leaves behind the rest with a newer queen. And they go and they camp out on a tree nearby in this big swarm. So here's an example of them waiting. And they have to figure out where they're going to move next. And this is really a critical moment for them because before they leave, they gorge themselves on honey. And they have only enough time until they're hungry again to find a new nest site. And both time, speed, and accuracy are of the essence because they need to do this fast or that could be fatal. And the quality of the nest site that they find where they're going to move into for the coming years is absolutely critical to their livelihood. And if they find something that's not of high enough quality, they can also all die if it doesn't work out. So central to the story of house hunting honeybees, for those of you who haven't read about this story, is something called the waggle dance. And this is the way they communicate in the process of making decisions, both about foraging and about house hunting. And this fellow Karl von Frisch was the person who actually decoded the waggle dance, and for this he won the Nobel Prize in 1973. He studied it in the context of honeybee foraging. Martin Landauer he did beautiful experiments in Munich to study the problem of house hunting, and he discovered that the waggle dance was central to house hunting as well. Tom Seeley, this is his student at that time, Susanna Berman, did some very important work. They essentially redid all of Martin Landauer's experiments, but with the help of video recording equipment. So they were able to dig deep into the mechanisms of how this group of 10,000 honeybees are able to collectively decide on one choice. In fact, they were able to show that the bees, through their deliberation processes, are able to pick the best of N when they have N different sites. There's a lot of modeling that's been going on. Mary Myers-Coe was one of the people who early on wrote down a model that was consistent with this behavior and showed that bees can choose best of N nest sites. So when a honeybee, when these bees come to their waiting point as they set out to look for a new nest site, it's only something like 3 to 4% of the bees that serve as scouts to look for the new site. So there's something like 300 or 400 bees perform as scouts, and only a very few start out looking. So a couple bees will fly out. So one will fly out and find a candidate nest site and inspect the nest site quite thoroughly, maybe even spend a half an hour there inside and out, come back to the swarm that was hanging on the tree, and do this waggle dance on the vertical surface in front of its neighbors, essentially to advertise the site that it's found. In fact, I mean, this is where it starts to get unbelievably phenomenal, that these individual bees can communicate about the site that they've just investigated, the direction, the distance, and the quality, which I'm going to call VI, of the ith site. So this is really phenomenal. And so how do they do that? They do this via this little dance. So a waggle dance consists of a series of these things called waggle runs. So a waggle run is essentially this closed circuit where they're dancing around. And they do this in something on the order of like 2 seconds. And what they do is they go around this way and then they go around this way. So essentially they're performing a figure 8 pattern. And the angle here, this is the first amazing piece, the angle here is relative to the vertical, relative to gravity, is equal to the azimuthal angle of the position of the feeding place, or in this case, the candidate nest site, relative to the sun. Pretty spectacular. So they can translate to their neighbors the direction of the site that they've just visited. They can also translate the distance, and they do that by the number of these little waggles here. So they basically vibrate their abdomen, and it's like they're jiggling back and forth. And the number of times they do that in a single run is proportional to the distance away of this honeybee candidate nest site. And then the quality this is also phenomenal. So the quality is both a combination of sort of the duration, it's like how many of these waggle runs they do in a particular dance, so the length of time, and also how lively they are. So if they cut down, they make the return time, this part of the circuit, really short, then it's as if they're livelier, they're more enthusiastic about their site. And then they'll, so if it's a 5-star nest site, they'll do something like 100 of these circuits in a particular dance. Or if it's a relatively poor site, they'll do something like 10 of these circuits. And what's interesting is that Tom Seeley, in his PhD thesis in 1975, did these experiments where he was able to understand exactly what it is that they care about in these nest sites. So there's a very clear notion of what makes for a good site, and we can understand what the quality is, and now we can decode. They can even run these experiments and watch the bees, and they can figure out where the site is that the bee is advertising for. So things like, these are usually cavities in a tree, something like 40-liter volume cavity, several meters off the ground, an entranceway of something like 15 centimeters squared that's towards the bottom of the cavity and facing south, makes for a 5-star kind of nest site for these bees. On the right here, I'm showing you a snapshot of one of these waggle dances. You can see, this is just a blur of the guy. It's not a guy, it's a she, doing the waggle dance. Okay, so we know how they communicate, and then it was through these experiments that Tom Seeley, Martin Landauer first, and then Tom Seeley did, that they began to understand the deliberations. So how is it that, each of these bees goes out, she explores, she comes back, another one goes out, finds a different candidate nest site. Let's assume just for the moment that there's only 2. Let's call one nest site A, one nest site B, and suppose B has a higher quality, higher value than A. What goes on? How are they ultimately able to convince or make sure that all 10,000 bees go to the better one? Well, what happens is that the one goes out, the investigating, comes back, advertises, hopefully recruits some others to go check it out. The original one will go back, continue to explore, come back. They go back and forth once they've checked out a site. The recruited ones will go themselves to check it out, make sure they agree that it's a worthy site, come back, do their advertising. There's a natural kind of decay, so if you go back and forth and you're not getting much reinforcement, individuals will lose interest in their original site. But there's commitment when somebody gets recruited or discovers a new nest site, they get interested. And then there's this recruitment process. And because there's enthusiasm that's large for those that are good and less for those that are poorer, we get this kind of growing interest in one site versus another. as there's the scouting, the committing, the recruiting, and then also the sort of losing interest in the not reinforced sites. And ultimately, what happens is they don't wait for a consensus decision. In this case, it's a quorum decision. So if any bee gets to its candidate nest site and finds that there's a quorum there, so it might even be as few as like 20 or 30 other bees at its candidate nest site, it's decided that there's a quorum because it's just a snapshot since the bees are coming back and forth, and there's enough bees that are interested in this site that it and all the others that are there will come back and they'll produce a new signal. It's called a piping signal. So essentially they come back and they say, hey guys, we've discovered that we have a quorum. And so they'll start piping and everybody else will start piping and then they'll all move together to the new site. And they do this, I mean, not perfectly, so every once in a while a honeybee swarm will get mixed up and won't make a decision, but this is sort of nearly flawless. Pretty amazing. And I have to say that that's actually not it. They do more, and this was something that was discovered very recently, that scouts actually apply what's called a stop signal that we would interpret sort of in the biology speak as a cross inhibition. And this is what happens that, you know, when somebody is dancing for site A, somebody who is committed to site B will literally, they vibrate their heads and they headbutt each other. So they literally kind of say, you know, you stop dancing. They temper the other recruiters' dancing, which happens to lead to, and as I'll show you, the ability for these bees not only to make the best of N decisions, but also to break deadlock. Pretty amazing. And this was first discovered and discussed in this paper in Science in 2012. And my colleagues and I went ahead to study this. And this is the model that Seeley et al. Used to describe these dynamics. So here, this is a population level model. YA is the fraction of the population that is committed to site A. YB is the fraction committed to site B. YU is the rest of the uncommitted, so YU is 1 minus YA minus YB. And these are the dynamics where we see just a simple term for decay of interest, just a dissipative term that's inversely proportional to the quality of the site. We see the commitment term, so the uncommitteds are getting committed at a rate that's proportional to the quality of the site. We see the recruitment, so when the uncommitteds come into contact with those recruiting for A, and then we see this cross-inhibition term. So when A's and B's meet, they apply this stop signaling. And so sigma here is this, sort of the strength or the rate of this headbutting, of this cross-inhibition kind of term. And so I'm showing you here just an example phase portrait. So these dynamics evolve on the 2 simplex because the total population is fixed here. And so here, this corner B refers to the whole population, YB being equal to 1. This is everybody committed to A, and this is everybody being uncommitted. And so you're looking at the flow in the case where VB is significantly greater than VA, like we saw in the previous slide. And there's only one there's only one equilibrium, globally stable equilibrium, up close to B. These red dotted lines refer to the quorum threshold. So once we're across this threshold, then the group will make a decision for B, or if we're across this threshold, the group will make a decision for A. And you can see here all the flow is towards the stable equilibrium, and here the decision will be made for B. Okay, so this is the model that we use to study and try to understand the nature of collective decision-making and adaptation. And so to start, it's easiest to look at the case of equal alternatives. And this is very interesting because of this problem of making good decisions but also handling the deadlock problem. So suppose that VA is equal to VB, and let's just call the quality V. Then we can rewrite the equations like this. And something, if we just look at these 2 phase portraits, you can see something very interesting already starting to emerge. So I've plotted this in the case where the quality takes the value 5. And then I'm looking at 2 different phase portraits for 2 different strengths of this kind of cross inhibition, two different strengths, sigma. So when sigma is really low, when they're not doing much of this stop signaling, what do we get? We get in this example, we get a single stable equilibrium where YA is equal to YB. So that's deadlock. All flow goes here. They make no decision. They just sit there, undecided. When sigma gets large enough, that equilibrium becomes unstable, and we get a symmetric pair of stable equilibria close to A and close to B. And so it's like they're flipping a coin, equal probability to go to A or B depending upon initial conditions. Pretty amazing. In fact, we can show that there's a pitchfork bifurcation here. So what does that mean? So I'm plotting here the projection of this of the solution. So the bottom, when this projected equilibrium equals 0, YB is equal to 1, so we make a decision for 1. YA is equal to 1 up here. And what we see that the solution as a function of sigma, this stop signaling rate, this cross inhibition rate, when it's small, like we saw before, we have deadlock. So here the blue refers to stable solutions and the red refers to unstable solutions. And then when we hit this critical value, sigma star, which we can derive as a function of the value, we get our pitchfork. And so for sigma greater than sigma star, we get the symmetric story where we get stable solution as we increase sigma. That's getting closer and closer to a decision for A, and one closer and closer to a decision for B. And the deadlock story is now unstable. And I've drawn in the threshold, so you can see that when sigma is a little bit greater than sigma star, then the B's will make their decision. So what's super interesting about this, as I noted, that the bifurcation point actually depends on the value of the sites. So why is that interesting? So in that previous example, I was showing you this slice right here at the quality V equal to 4, okay? So when V is equal to 4 and I move along my stop signal rate, I increase it. In this gray area, the solution there's just a single stable solution, so this is sort of the deadlock region. In this white area, we have 3 solutions, 2 stable, 1 unstable. And so you can see that this is the pitchfork right here when sigma is equal to sigma star, and then we move into the region in which we have essentially the deadlock breaking. But this varies with, inversely, the position of the pitchfork varies inversely with the quality. So what does this mean? So for example, suppose that the bees have evolved to have a stop signaling rate that's, let's say, 1.7, so that when the quality of the nest sites is greater than 3, it means that it's good enough and they should very quickly make a decision and flip a coin, essentially. But when the quality is poor, so you have these 2 equal quality but poor nest sites, it kind of makes sense that maybe they don't want to go ahead and break deadlock, that maybe they want to sit and wait for somebody to discover a new and better alternative. Pretty amazing. It's already adaptive, and they haven't even changed anything. So they have this parameter fixed, and they will adapt to whether the sites they find are good or bad when they think about making decisions. And, so it already sort of inspires some ideas. It's possible that the bees actually adapt their stop signaling rate. So you can think about sigma here as like a control gain, that they might change gradually because they don't want to wait forever. So they might have to settle on flipping a coin between these 2 poor sites. We can also think about it if we're thinking forward towards control. If we can get access to this control gain, we might want to ramp it up so that our design system will eventually make a decision, won't wait forever to flip a coin if, in the case that the alternatives aren't so great. And so this is a simulation where we've put in some stochasticity where you're looking at what the population is doing. So you're looking at YA and YB here as a function of time, and I'm ramping up sigma as a function of time in a linear way, and you can kind of see that at the beginning there's deadlock, and then once we cross this critical value, one of these gets chosen. We essentially flip a coin. Okay, so that's the story when there are equal alternatives. Of course, we know that there's necessarily going to be some kind of slight perturbation away from the perfect symmetric case. So we want to look at the case of near equal alternatives. And this is really interesting because we want to ask the question, when do the bees decide to discriminate between the two, or when do they call them the same and then just do the same kind of flipping the coin? And so you can write the dynamics down as before, except now we have different alternatives. So here I'm just using the notation delta V is VA minus VB, and V bar is just the average quality of the sites. Okay, and so then instead of the pitchfork bifurcation, we get a bifurcation plot that looks like this. So this is very interesting. So if you look for very large sigma, it kind of looks like the pitchfork. If you look for very small sigma, it looks like the pitchfork. But right at the singularity, we get something different. In fact, in singularity theory speak, they would refer to this as a robust decision because we have this all the time stable equilibrium, and then we have this saddle node bifurcation out here. So if we were sitting here and the perturbation was introduced, we would be attracted to this solution, and we would stay in its region of attraction. As we increased sigma, we'd make a decision for the better of the two alternatives. Here, delta V is a little bit positive. And in the language, as you'll see, of singularity theory, we say that this asymmetric model lives in the universal unfolding of a pitchfork singularity. So this is actually kind of to be expected, this bifurcation picture. Okay, there's even more interesting stuff that goes on. That's also sort of part of the pitchfork singularity, and that is that there's hysteresis in the decision-making, the choice between A and B in this case. So I'm showing you here now a plot. Here sigma is now on the vertical, our stop signaling strength, and delta V, the difference between the alternatives, is on the horizontal axis. And so the white area here refers to a single solution. B is dominating here, A is dominating here, and the blue area refers to the case where we have bistability. We have three solutions, two of which are stable. And so when delta V is 0, we move along sigma, we get our old pitchfork story. Right here's the pitchfork bifurcation right here. When delta V is nearby, we get this story where we have a saddle node bifurcation, which is this dotted or dashed red line. But now suppose we fix sigma, so I'll fix in this picture, I fix sigma equal to 5, and we move along this direction. So we see what happens as the values change. So in the honeybee story, maybe one of the sites is deteriorating, or if this were something that we had access to, say again, as a control input, we could think about how to manipulate this to get this kind of behavior. But what essentially happens is that, were the sites to change, suppose first B is much better than A, we're down here in the solution choosing B, and we have to actually move all the way through this bistable region. So A has to become at least a little bit better. It doesn't immediately switch to A. There's a little bit of robustness here. A has to become a little bit better than B in order for the Bs to make a switch to A. And then we'll move along this set of solutions. We'll jump up here. And then if A starts to deteriorate, it has to deteriorate sufficiently again to switch back to a decision for B. Okay. So I want to next introduce this notion of singularities and singularity theory, and this idea of how singularities can be used to organize collective decision-making behaviors like the one we just saw. And the theory starts by taking your evolution equations and doing a Lyapunov-Schmidt reduction, which is essentially a projection onto the space associated with the zero eigenvalue, the linearization of this kind of singular point that you're studying. But essentially the idea is that you reduce down to a scalar equation from which one solves for all the solutions of your dynamics. So here G is a scalar equation, Y is this one-dimensional, this scalar reduced state, and lambda here is a parameter which we could think of as a control gain. It also plays the role of the bifurcation parameter. Okay, so you find your solutions to your dynamics by solving G is equal to 0, And those solutions, y star, lambda star, are singularities when they're non-hyperbolic solutions, so when g is equal to 0 and the derivative of g at y is equal to 0. And so then what this theory gives us, in a very systematic way, for a whole set of singularities, is the following three set of techniques. One is solving what they call the recognition problem. So you can take your G, apply these a set of conditions, and determine under what conditions your G is equivalent to another G or H, another system. So they have a way of coming up with essentially equivalence classes of these kinds of reduced equations. And then they classify all qualitative types of these singularities, of these solution equations, and this is where we get this notion of organizing center. So each qualitative type is like an organizing center. And then furthermore, they're able to enumerate for each of these singularities what one gets in terms of, like, what are all the possible bifurcation diagrams that one can get if you introduce perturbations to the dynamics. So we have our sort of symmetric singularity, and we introduce perturbations in the following way. It's called the universal unfolding of G. And it's a k-parameter family of functions, and I'll call it capital G, of y and lambda, and then the k-parameters, alpha 1 through alpha k, such that when alpha 1 through alpha k are all equal to 0, we get back our original solutions. And then for any small perturbation p, there exists some set of parameters, alpha 1 through alpha k, such that our solution equation plus that perturbation is equivalent to this G at that value of alpha. Okay, so that makes sense. So let me illustrate this in the case of the pitchfork singularity, because that's the one that organizes this honeybee decision making and that I'm going to proceed with. Okay, so here are the conditions to check. So you've reduced your system, you have your solution equation, you check these conditions. And if these conditions hold, then you've proved that you have a pitchfork singularity. And once you've done that, you know it's equivalent to all other pitchfork singularities. Pretty amazing. And here's the normal form for a pitchfork singularity. Okay, and here is the bifurcation diagram that we've seen before, just recently for the honeybee story. So y again is the state, the scalar state, lambda is the bifurcation parameter, and y star lambda star is the singular point. Then, for the pitchfork singularity, one can write down the set of all possible perturbations through this universal unfolding called capital G, right? And the pitchfork singularity happens to be a codimension 2, which means there's there's a plane of possible small perturbations parameterized by alpha 1, alpha 2, and when alpha 1 equal alpha 2, of course, we get back equals 0, we get back our symmetric pitchfork bifurcation. And the theory tells us what happens for all possible values, small values of alpha 1, alpha 2. Okay, so this is the alpha 1, alpha 2 plane, and there are basically 4 possible bifurcation diagrams that you can get if you have a pitchfork singularity and you add perturbations to your dynamics. And of course, this is the one we just saw. In the case of the honeybees, here's the symmetric case, and here are 2 others that are slightly different, but not so very different. Okay, so let's relate this theory back to what we just understood for the honeybees, and it's convenient to change coordinates. So here, phi is ya minus yb, the fraction of population for A minus fraction for B, and psi is the sum ya plus yb. And actually, you don't even have to do Lyapunov-Schmidt here, because it turns out that the direction associated with the 0 eigenvalue at our bifurcation point is the direction phi, and we can write down a global equation for the solutions of our dynamics that looks like this, and this is in the case of equal alternatives. So if we then go into the theory and apply the conditions for checking this recognition problem, we check these conditions on this very G, we can see that they're satisfied, and we therefore can conclude that we do indeed have this, we have proved a pitchfork bifurcation when phi star is equal to 0. Remember, that's when YA is equal to YB, that's our deadlock position, and when sigma star is equal to this function of V, which is inversely related to V. And then, from the theory, we understand how to write down the unfolding, the universal unfolding. And I've just sort of written here to suggest that we know how to write down, of course, this full equation, which tells us the solutions and how they change as a function of not just the parameter sigma, but as a function of perturbations to the dynamics. So this singularity theory allows us to do local analysis, and actually it turns out in these dynamics that they are monotone, they have bounded trajectories, so the theory of monotone systems with bounded trajectories allows us to do a global analysis so that we can, for instance, in the case, I'm showing you back the original phase portraits, when sigma is small, less than sigma star, our solution is globally asymptotically stable, so all solutions will go to this deadlock position. And when sigma is greater than sigma star, we get the two symmetric stable solutions, and this deadlock position becomes unstable, and the unstable manifold associated with this unstable saddle point is globally asymptotically stable. So all solutions will come to this manifold, and almost all of them, except those that live right at the unstable equilibrium, will go either to B or to A. Okay, so then you recall that this theory gives us this equivalence, and so this is where things start to get very interesting and where we can start to think about connecting the many different ways in which we see collective decision-making in nature. So for instance, so we know that this G is equivalent to any other G or H a solution equation that we find in any other situation that's organized by a pitchfork singularity. And so I'm showing you some pictures from a paper that was written in 2011 in Science, and this is for a totally different animal and a totally different mechanism, but this was a case of looking at directional choices among this tightly schooling fish called the golden shiners. And so Ian Cousin, my colleague at Princeton, ran these experiments where he would train a small subset of the fish to know about one or the other of a target in of food in the tank. So some of like a little group would know about the blue target, another little group would know about the yellow target, and all the rest would be completely naive. They wouldn't know that there was food out there. And he'd put them in the tank together, and he'd lift the gate, and they would all swim together. It's very scary to go off on your own, and they would choose one or the other. And so he tried to understand, particularly in the asymmetric case, when one of the targets was more attractive, or if there were more that were trained on one or the other, which decision would be made. And one of the interesting findings was that the decision was made as a function of what fraction of the population were naive. So the naive individuals were actually playing a role in the decision making. But one of the things I want you to notice is that in the context of, this was a model that was derived that gave results consistent to the experiment, but here's a bifurcation plot that looks precisely like the unfolding of a pitchfork bifurcation. And the bifurcation parameter here is the density of uninformed, the naive individuals. So this is just to say that there is now a sort of a formal way to connect these kinds of results and these kind of mechanisms to this seemingly very, very different mechanism, but similar outcome in terms of the nature of behavior as a pitchfork and its unfolding in the context of the honeybees. And then our idea, as I motivated at the beginning, is to connect up with an abstract model. So here's the idea for our approach to realizing this and to connecting nature to design, is that we're going to propose here an abstract model of collective decision-making that's also organized by a pitchfork singularity. Okay, so then using the equivalence of the solution equation to the ones that we discover in nature, we'll be able to connect up in a rigorous way. So it will allow us to do things like translate the insights that we learn from the mechanisms discovered in nature to doing things systematically and rigorously in design. Okay, so let me just introduce to you the abstract model. It's very straightforward. We think about a system that has n agents. This is our multi-agent system. And each agent is only going to have a scalar state. So you can think about this as their decision variable, their opinion, xi. And it's a real number. And we're going to imagine that xi, when it reaches +1, will be fully committed to one alternative. We'll call it alternative A. When it's equal to 0, it's completely uncommitted. And when it's equal to -1, it's fully committed to another alternative. We'll call it B. Okay, and then we're going to assume that the agents are connected. So we'll assume, in this case, just a static connected graph that describes who is sensing or communicating with whom. And this will be encoded by a Laplacian, n by n Laplacian matrix L, which is the difference between a diagonal matrix D, where the entries on the diagonal are all positive and refer to the out degree of the agents. And A is the adjacency matrix. So the entries of A are the weights on the edges of the graph, all positive, or 0, so non-negative. And then we'll write down our control system, or our control dynamics as follows. So these are first order dynamics. So xi dot is equal to ui. Ui is the control, feedback control for the ith individual. And it looks like a dissipative term. So this is minus di. Di, again, is the out degree of agent I. Positive. D is positive. And so if there's no second term, the individual will just go to the uncommitted state. And then what we have here is this weighted sum of the opinions of all the neighbors that it can sense. So the weights Aij are these weights on the edges, as I mentioned. K here is a control gain, and S is a saturation function. Okay, so any saturation function has slope K, essentially. Okay, so the idea is, you can kind of see that when the xi's are all very small, this looks like just a standard linear consensus dynamic. So this is like a saturation on the consensus dynamics. And so this is what the dynamics look like in a vector form. So here x is just a vector of all the opinions of all the n agents. And so we can proceed with our singularity theory. We can apply first the Lyapunov-Schmidt reduction, which we've done, and written a scalar equation. And it's maybe easy to appreciate that the zero eigenvalue at the bifurcation point is going to be the direction of consensus. So this equation is a scalar equation in Y, where Y is essentially the sum of the opinions of our agents. K is like our bifurcation parameter. And so we can check the conditions for the singularity and prove that we get a pitchfork singularity at y star is equal to 0, right? That's the deadlock position, right? Where the average of the opinions is equal to 0, and k star is equal to 1. And we can go on to refine this a little bit. So we've added here a gain in front of this term, and we've added a little addition here, alpha I. So for an individual, the controller looks a little bit more refined. The idea being that we want to look at a slightly richer abstract model that we could sort of fit to our different biological models. So here, think about alpha I as a choice between something that looks like VA minus 1, 0, or minus VB minus 1. So it's like each individual is having a chance to scout out or have some information about a site or a location of food. And one can check that if VA equal VB equals C equal 1, we get the previous case. So this is truly a refinement. If VA equal VB equal V is greater than 1, but there's symmetry in the alpha I's, so there's an equal number that are have a positive as a negative value, an equal number of individuals, we retain this, we can prove this pitchfork singularity. And interestingly, we can prove that the bifurcation point is now inversely related to V, the value of the site, if we were to map this onto the honeybee story. Okay, so here, through the equivalence of the pitchfork singularity, we can map our G to the honeybee story. We can map the sigma back there to the K here, and the sigma star to the K star here. So we're starting to realize through an abstract model the kinds of behavior that we saw before, and then we can go on to think about the asymmetric case and know that we will get the universal unfolding. We'll get one of the four kinds of pictures. And what's really interesting is that we can actually evaluate performance here, and we can ask questions that we aren't able to ask in these very particularized models that we've used to model animal behavior. So we can ask things like, as a function of the network topology, as a function of who has information about one site or the other and where they're located in the network topology, you know, what does this picture look like? For instance, what's the slope here? How fast are they going to make a decision? We can understand things about leadership from an analysis of this story that's done in an abstract way. We could do things like come up with predictable hypotheses, testable hypotheses for the animal groups and go back and see if it's really what's going on and learn more and refine the model. But we can also use it to design in control. And we can do things like move outside of the parameter ranges that we find in nature if it suits our engineering needs. So to summarize, what we've done, or we've begun to do, is come up with a realization of collective decision-making, in this case organized by the pitchfork, that gives us a way to rigorously connect the performance and the analysis of performance in animal groups to a principled and systematic approach to doing design for multi-agent control systems. And because singularity theory is so systematic, because the whole theory is the machinery just translates in an equivalent way to any other singularity, the idea is that if we can come up with realizations or models that realize other kinds of singularities, we can just port this whole system in a systematic way to other kinds of decision-making scenarios. So for instance, we have looked at decision-making among more than two alternatives, as you might expect. This is an example where we have dynamics that model imitation and error in decision-making among populations when there's a finite number of alternatives. And for instance, we're able to do things like this is, I'm showing you the case in which there are three alternatives, and there's a network structure among who's imitating and who other kinds of decision-making. We're able to do things like prove the existence of Hopf bifurcations and limit cycles. So this is another place in which we could imagine deriving an abstract model to realize this, organized by these kinds of singularities that we could then connect to what we understand in nature to design. And I'm also hoping that we'll be able to make connections. We're doing a lot of work in other domains of studying collective animal behavior, and I've shown you a few examples where we're either working with biologists who are producing the data, or we're actually collecting data. My student just came back from Kenya where he was filming zebras, and we are looking at the dynamics of pursuit and evasion of herds. We are looking at, with colleagues who study starlings, we have been looking at the problem of robustness of starling flocks. With colleagues in Munich, we've been looking at some really interesting data on how humans make coordinated decisions when there's conflicts in preference and information available and they can't directly communicate with one another. And in a project with some colleagues in dance at Princeton, we've been looking at the emergence of leadership in human groups. So these are dancers who carry out rules like the rules that we use to model collective animal behavior, but because we can tell them what to do, we're able to use video processing and analyze the changing network structure and understand who emerges as leaders and influences the dynamics of the group. So hopefully these kinds of approaches will be able to translate to some of these other settings. So before I end, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues in the work on honeybees. This was done with my former PhD student, Darren Pice, with my colleague, James Marshall, who's a professor of computer science at the University of Sheffield in UK, and his former postdoc, Patrick Hogan. And on this work on our abstract model and the pitchfork singularity as an organizing principle, this is done with Alessio Franzi, who's postdoc at Cambridge University, and Vaibhav Srivastava, who's a postdoc working with me at Princeton. I'd also like to acknowledge my amazing, talented, hardworking, creative research group at Princeton. Also my colleagues, Ian Cousin, Simon Levin, who are on the faculty in ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton, with whom I work quite closely and learn a lot of biology from. And support from the U.S. Office of Naval Research, the Army Research Office, and the National Science Foundation. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge my wonderful and inspiring family, my daughter Lily, my husband Tim, my daughter Amara, who Amara is here today in the audience. It's a great treat. She's joined me on this trip. She was my moral inspiration for climbing the rather treacherous route up Table Mountain yesterday. And it's wonderful to have her here. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for your attention.
Well, on behalf of the audience, I would like to thank Naomi for this really fantastic lecture. You have set a very high standard for this Congress, very hard to match. And I am sure that this lecture will inspire scores of followers and admirers. And you have taught us new frontiers in systems analysis and system science. And I'm sure that this will impress a lot of young people to orientate their research. So the policy of the Congress that we are not allowing questions, and so I'm sure that there will be thousands of questions, but the interested speakers, the interested attendants may ask questions directly to the speaker during the break during the next days. So I would like you to join me in giving a big hand to Naomi for this exceptional lecture.